बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम।
शुरू अल्लाह का नाम लेकर जो बड़ा मेहरबान निहायत रहम वाला है।
इन्ना अअतैनाकल कौसर।
ए नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम, हमने तुमको कौसर यानी बहुत ज्यादा भलाई अता फरमाई है।
फसल्लि लिरब्बिक वन्हर।
तो अपने परवरदिगार के लिए नमाज पढ़ा करो और कुर्बानी किया करो।
इन्न शानिअक हुवल अबतर।
कुछ शक नहीं कि तुम्हारा दुश्मन ही बेनाम रहेगा।
Honorable guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute of Strategic Studies Islamabad, I welcome you all to the launch of India Study Center's flagship report titled Voices on Kashmir. Ladies and gentlemen, the chief guest for today's event is Mr. Asim Iftikhar Ahmed, spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are thankful to him for gracing the occasion with his presence. For the formal proceedings of the event, I request Dr. Arshad Ali, Director, India Study Center, Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Qasim. Honorable Chief Guest Asim Iftikhar Ahmed Saab, Distinguished Speaker Khalid Rahman Saab, Altaf Hussain Wani Saab, and Ahmed Qureshi Saab. Respected guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good morning. My name is Dr. Arshad Ali, and I am the Director of India Study Center at the Institute. I warmly welcome you all to the launching ceremony of our report, Voices on Kashmir. Dear participants, the Jammu and Kashmir issue is the core dispute between India and Pakistan. It is the longest pending dispute on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council since October 1947, when India illegally occupied parts of Jammu and Kashmir. 3 years ago, on August 5, 2019, India illegally and unilaterally revoked the special status of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir in violation of international law, including UN Security Council resolution, the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as Shimla Accord. Since independence in 1947, the people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir have experienced all forms of violence and atrocities. To subjugate Kashmiris, the Indian government resorted to ruthless oppression in the valley, which culminated in the event of August 5, 2019. Nonetheless, it was the determination of the people of Kashmir in the face of the most brutal atrocities that finally caught the attention of the world community. Today, there is a pressing need for an early resolution of the Kashmir dispute according to the wishes of the Kashmiri people and the UN Security Council resolutions. Dear participants, Pakistan has used every platform to highlight the humanitarian, legal and peace and security dimension of the Kashmir dispute at the global level. Our report, Voices on Kashmir, is an effort by the India Study Center at the Institute to highlight the concerns of the global community expressed in solidarity with the brave people of Kashmir. Dear participants, these are the voices of conscience from all over the world, that is from Europe to America, let alone regional organizations to global institutions, to highlight the plight of Kashmiris from the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. It is also an effort to urge India that lasting peace in the South Asian region depends upon the resolution of the Kashmir issue according to their right to self-determination. And the way to achieve this goal goes through the negotiation table. Let me thank our DG ISSI Ambassador Azad Ahmed Chaudhry for his guidance and supervision in preparing this report. Sir, I'm grateful to you for your constant support and assistance. I must also appreciate the hard work of our team, Ms. Mahwish, Ali Beg, Ms. Misbah, and Mr. Qasim at our India Study Center. With these acknowledgements, I would like to ask Qasim for further proceedings of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arshad Ali. Now I would like to request the Director General of the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry, for his welcome remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to begin by welcoming you all to this event. And as always, our hall is 4/5 replete with the youngsters, and that's a new policy that we follow in our institute. Bulk of our audience is now becoming the young scholars and researchers, because we want not only to sit in any echo chamber, but we want our future generation to hear us and carry it forward. I want to also commend you, Arshad, and your hardworking team to produce this report. It took us about a year to produce this, to work on it. And as you would see once you see this report, there are no speculation, no conjecture. All statements are recorded in history and they are duly referenced. Secondly, the voices are from the world leaders and institutions and also from within India. But no Pakistani statement has been added to it, because that will be subject of a separate volume that we intend to prepare. Somebody asked me, why should you prepare that? It's well known. I said, no, Pakistanis have to know that since 1947 till today, every political leader, every academic has an ownership of this agenda. So that's why we want to work on that. Now, before I say anything else, I want to read this statement with you from this book. It is on page 81. From former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zayed Rad Al Hussein. The political dimensions of the dispute between India and Pakistan have long been center stage, but this is not a conflict frozen in time. It is a conflict that has robbed millions of their basic human rights and continues to this day inflict untold suffering. Then he goes on to say, it is also why I will be urging the UN Human Rights Council to consider establishing a commission of inquiry to conduct a comprehensive independent international investigation into allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir. So such are the powerful statements which are now documented and recorded in this book. Let me welcome you, Asim Iftikhar Ahmed Sahib, Ambassador Sahib, as the chief guest. We are truly honored to have your presence. You have been a steadfast defender and promoter of Pakistan's policy narratives. One key element of our foreign policy is to work with the international community to enable the Kashmiris to exercise their right to self-determination. Having seen you in New York and also in Islamabad, you've always promoted our foreign policy goals. And so thank you for accepting to be the chief guest for this endeavor, which in turn signifies your attachment to the Kashmir cause. Dr. Khalid Rahman Sahib, sir, thank you for agreeing to give keynote address on this important subject. Who would be more convinced of the validity of the Kashmir cause than you, who has spent a lifetime advocating the rights of the Kashmiris. And thank you also, Wani Sahib. You are running an institute, and over the years, you and your institute have emerged as an authentic voice of the Kashmiris. So look forward to listening to you. Ahmed Qureshi Sahib, again, thank you. You have worked hard in projecting Kashmir's case as a lobbyist for Kashmir cause and also as a journalist and TV anchor. You have participated in many of our events, and we have always found you an articulate advocate of the Kashmir cause, and it's such a it's good to have you with us today. One academic, Dr. Asma Khaja, was to join us, but for some pressing last-minute commitment she couldn't. Ladies and gentlemen, this institute, as you are aware, is an autonomous and independent institute which works with funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have a special attachment to the foreign policy and security policy agenda of Pakistan. Anything that has strategic significance for us is important. Since Kashmir dispute is one of the longest outstanding issues to be resolved, this institute has been playing its part in marking our solidarity with the Kashmiris, as well as projecting the validity of the Kashmir cause, be it Solidarity Day, 5 February, or Black Day, 27 October, or from this year, Yom-e Istihsal, 5 August. In addition, our institute has also contributed dozens of research articles and policy briefs on the Kashmir dispute and related developments. Today, we are launching a report that, as I indicated earlier, took us a year to make, and we had the privilege of presenting an advance copy to Honorable Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari Sahib on our Foundation Day. So we hope that we will share this document as widely as possible, perhaps including in our missions abroad, and so that our Kashmiri brethren who are facing such atrocities would know that there are people in Pakistan, in fact the entire Pakistani nation, who cares for them. Allah bless you all, Allah bless Pakistan, and also Allah protect the Kashmiris who are suffering from the untold miseries afflicted on them by the Indian forces. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a distinguished panel of speakers with us today. Our keynote speaker is Mr. Khalid Rahman. Mr. Rahman is one of the pioneers of the Institute of Policy Studies. He is currently serving as the chairman of IPS. His vast experience in research, training, and management has contributed significantly towards turning IPS into a dynamic think tank. I now invite Mr. Khalid Rahman for his remarks.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Chairman and chief guest of the session, Ambassador Asim Iftikhar Sahab, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood Sahab, Chairman of the Institute of Strategic Studies, and Director General Ezaz Chaudhry Sahab, my co-panelists and guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be at the Institute of Strategic Studies, not only to come as a speaker, but also to listen whatever is happening here, because it is always an experience to gain knowledge and understanding of so many issues on which, of course, we are also working. So it was a pleasure when I received this invitation and the copy of the report. I went through it, and I would like to certainly congratulate Dr. Arshad and his team, and of course the Institute of Strategic Studies, for coming up with this very beautifully produced publication. When we look at the issue of Kashmir, under a simple logic that there is an area where people live, and these people are seeking and making a struggle for their right of self-determination. The international law is in their favor. The United Nations resolution are in their favor. India had agreed Pakistan is always ready for that. So this is a very simple thing. It should have happened much earlier, but this is not happening. The reason is quite obvious. One, the stubbornness of the Indians. Two, the global system, which has so many complications and which essentially favors the powerful and their interest. So we are continuing with a situation where it is now the fourth or fifth generation of the Kashmiris which is sacrificing their lives, but of course they are not ready to compromise on their cause. So when they are continuing, and Pakistan is also a party to the case, we have a role. And we can't sit back. And that's why these kind of efforts to bring in or to continue the discourse in the direction which favors the Kashmiris, that is very important and very useful, and I would always call it timely whenever it is happening. In fact, we need to perhaps double or triple our efforts in these areas. So I once again commend you. But as far as the report is concerned, I went through each and every page, and while I regard it an important work, I was continuously thinking that this should be regarded as a work in progress. And I'm glad that Ambassador Saab, you said that another volume is coming. In fact, I feel there must be many more volumes, and at least 5 or 6 or 7 areas I have identified, which can be the future volumes under this series, that Voices on Kashmir. When I say this, the first question that comes to my mind is, who is the prime stakeholder of this whole issue? I think there is no doubt that Kashmiris are the prime stakeholders. But when we go to this volume, we find that a lot of Kashmiris are missing whose voices should be here. In fact, from the history, we find Sheikh Abdullah is here. And from the current Kashmiris, we find one is Ghulam Nabi Fai. He is a different character or is a different player. But Mehbooba Mufti and Umar Abdullah. So I think this is not the Kashmiri's voice. Our report is practically missing the Kashmiri's voice. And these two, including Sheikh Abdullah, these three, as well as Maulana Mirwais, they have been given in the section which is basically the section from India. So I think we need to be careful while we are producing further volumes that even these people have been, I mean, Mirwais is a different person, but as far as Mehbooba Mufti is concerned and Umar Abdullah is concerned, they should not be bracketed with the Indians, particularly in the current scenario where they are fighting against the 5 August 2019 decision. So Kashmiris are the prime stakeholders, and they should have more voices. Gilani, Yasin Malik, Shabbir Shah, Indrabi, you can name several people. And in fact, these are very prominent people. But from amongst the Kashmiris, there are thousands and thousands of people who are raising their voices in different ways, not only through their tongue and their speech, but their actions need to be really documented in such a way that they create a message and they give a message to the whole world. What could be that message? I think an intelligently produced volume on the, related to the voices of Kashmiris on Kashmir should convey at least 3 or 4 messages. First is the continuity and consistency of the movement. That it has not erupted in 1989 or in some other era, but there is a continuity, and in fact it should be linked with the 1931 incidents so that it carries more weight. So what are the Kashmir voices which reflect that this is not a new issue, this is an old issue, and that on that old issue, Kashmiris are always united. Their strategies might be different, but the Kashmiris are always united and they are pursuing it consistently. The second message that should emerge, and it is related to the first message, that all segments of the society, they are together as far as the liberation from India is concerned. There has always been a small group, maybe powerful for different reasons, who have been cooperating and aligning with India, but they were also always wanted a kind of autonomy and separate status. The other aspect that should be conveyed by that particular volume from the Voices on Kashmir, primarily it's a political movement. Primarily it is a political movement. If they have resorted to force, there are reasons for that. And this is one of those rights that they are allowed. So this message should be conveyed through those voices, that it is primarily and also an indigenous movement. An indigenous movement which is primarily political, and if they have resorted to weapons, there are enough reasons for that, and they have a reasonable case for that. And perhaps I found there are a number of pictures, photographs in this, which convey certain messages, but that particular volume, which is Voices from Kashmir, on Kashmir, I suggest that there could be a pictorial, photograph based, again, keeping in view these messages. And here I would like to point out one thing. Lately, I feel that we have converted the whole issue into human rights violations. While this is an outcome of the whole issue, of the way the dispute is going on, this is not the real issue. And we should, in fact, avoid entering into this area. This could be an immediate, quick relief, yes, painkiller. But this is not going to solve the problem. In fact, I would regard it as success of the Indians that all over the world, the issue is being discussed under the human rights violation title. So in my view, when we are preparing that particular volume and the other such reports, I think we should be very careful that this is not an issue of human right fundamentally, while human rights are extremely important. Related to that, I would also like to point out at this particular moment that there are huge violations of the international humanitarian laws. In fact, this human rights slogan that has overshadowed the violations that Indians are making of the international humanitarian laws. So who is going to talk about that? While there is enough case for that, and that case is not only important for the media purposes, but in fact, there are spaces available in the world that under an organized effort, we can go there and file cases against the Indian officials who are making these violations. So this is one thing. As has been mentioned by Ambassador Saab, I'm glad that another volume on Pakistan is already in the pipeline and you are doing that. Again, I would like to emphasize two things, that what that particular volume should convey. I think you have rightly pointed out that across the board, the whole Pakistani nation, as far as the cause is concerned, is together. They are united for that. There could always be difference of opinion how to move for that. And this is something good, I would say. So that is okay, but that should be conveyed through that volume that the Pakistani nation is together, united, and they are behind the movement. What else? I think we need to very, in detail, we should need also to have a kind of in-house part of that volume. That where we went wrong. There are a number of instances one can cite. I think all of you are well aware of that. So where we went wrong. And only last week, we found this statement from the Prime Minister of Pakistan saying that war is not an option. Is it necessary to say? Number one, it is an option. And I remember one of the sessions here where Ambassador Masood Khan was speaking. And he also spoke. In fact, there is every reason in case of Kashmir that war should be declared as an option. When, how, what would be the prime time for that? That's another decision. But to, all this complaint from the international community, to the international community, that they are not participating or they are not taking any measures to solve this problem. I mean, these kind of complaints are useless if they have no problem. And with this, I come to the part that is the longest part of this report, which, I'm raising these questions in the spirit that when we are preparing more volumes, these volumes should have that kind of input. The longest part relates to America. Quite understandably, that is the elephant in the house. So how can we ignore America? I think almost 1/3 of the report consists of statements from America. But when you see the statements of the officials, it's a good documentation. It shows that how did they respond to the situation that emerged on 5 August 2019 in occupied Kashmir. But then what is that response? I really failed to find out something which could be regarded as something tangible in which the Americans are taking any kind of note that we shall put pressure on India. We shall ask India, if not to go for plebiscite right now, but at least to withdraw this step that, in fact, I would say it is an attack on Kashmir. Once again, an attack on Kashmir. They have said none of this kind of thing in their statements. Only perhaps exception is Bernie Sanders, who has unequivocally, I would say, has said that this should be under the UN resolution should be addressed. So then the question is, I'm not saying that we should not document it, but then I would perhaps like the DG to ponder. When you say that we are not entering into or we are not making any comment, I think in this whole war of narrative, without sharing something which you do not agree, without a comment, that creates problems. So the message is that as far as the American leadership is concerned, they are not going to make any pressure or to put any pressure on India. The statements are very clear. We are concerned. We would like Pakistan and India to sit together to solve the problem, etc., etc. So I think without qualifying all these statements, that may not be the useful for us to, in fact, spread. So what is the counter argument for that? That should be there. And here, once again, I would like to point out one thing, which by and large, it seems that though we do not accept it, but practically we are accepting it. The Americans are saying, The others are saying, even even Mahathir Mohamad, even Tayyip Erdogan, you have included these statements. These are very useful statements. Everyone is trying to say that Pakistan and India should sit together. Is it a bilateral issue? It is a bilateral issue, yes, but it has larger implications. So at least from Pakistan, we should try to convince people and to bring the narrative onto this stage that while India and Pakistan, along with Kashmiris, are the key parties to the dispute, but the whole world is a party to it. It's not a bilateral issue, since it is on the UN agenda. So that is also very important. As far as the statements from Europe are concerned, I found it relatively useful, and their documentation is also going to help us. From Americans' list, I found that Chatterjee and Natasha Cole, they are saying something reasonable along with Bernie Sanders. But now, one thing, maybe the last question I would say in this whole discussion is about the, I would say, yeah. What has India achieved after 5 August 2019? It has taken a number of steps. And very obviously, it is trying to change the demographics, and in the hope that perhaps there will be a time then it will say, okay, let us have plebiscite there. I think we should not wait for that time. If that is their design, we should try to expose it, not by just complaining that they are changing, that whenever the plebiscite will take place, it will be taking place on the basis of this or these facts. And anything added beyond that is not going to be. I'm just throwing this at this platform. The idea is to be doing some homework that how we will be addressing that situation, and for that, what kind of homework we will be doing. At the same time, I would like to point out that instead of looking things from the position of weakness, we should try to find out there are a lot of positive things. And let me quote the statement that has been given by P. Chidambaram, and that is included here in this report also, that says, we have practically lost Kashmir. And he was saying it in 2020, after this whole attack of India on Kashmir. No democratic country can keep an entire population under siege. This is one voice that has been included in this report. But I am sure, and I can say that this is one of those volumes that should also be developed, wherein these kind of genuine statements which look at the ground with an independent eye or neutral eye, even from India, and there are many, that should be included in a large number. So thank you very much. I really regard it a good contribution, but as I said, we should consider it as work in progress, and not one volume, but in a number of volumes are needed, and I am sure that you have the capacity and you have the leadership to go for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your keynote address, sir. Our first speaker is Mr. Altaf Hussain Wani. Mr. Wani has previously served as the permanent representative of the International Islamic Federation of Students Organizations to the UN in Geneva, and is currently serving as the chairman of the Kashmir Institute of International Relations. I now invite Mr. Wani for his remarks.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Honorable Chairman, Director General, Chief Guest of the Day, Dr. Khalid Rahman Saab, Dr. Arshad, Mr. Qureshi, dear colleagues, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think, first of all, I should commend the India Studies Center, Institute of Strategic Studies, for producing this wonderful report, because it was need of the hour for a long time. As we see, always in our discourse, it was there that international community, or there is very less on Kashmir in international press and this and that. It was always in our discourses whenever we meet in seminars, in conference and all that. All the speakers would say that international press is mute on Kashmir, international scholars are mute on Kashmir, international community is mute on Kashmir. Thereby, we were communicating a very negative message to our youth, to our audience, that nobody is listening to Kashmir. So, to produce a report like this enlightens our younger generation that there are takers of Kashmir at international level. People do talk about Kashmir. People do have concern about Kashmir, and there are lots of policy implications if those are not implemented. As in my institute, as a researcher, when I started working on human rights documenting reports, right from 2008 onwards, I started a part of my human rights reports on these international concerns. I will always document, I will always share the links of international leaders, international newspapers on that, because of the page problem, and we can't publish a huge report, so it was only based on links and all that. But lately in 2019, me and Ahmed came with a idea that we should have a support and a report on it, so that we could disseminate in our younger generation, so they come to know there's a lot of discussion on Kashmir at international level. There is a lot been said. We should not say always that there is nothing on Kashmir. So Youth Forum for Kashmir, they released a report, International Reactions on Kashmir, that was in 2019 earlier. And then at Kashmir Institute of International, we used to produce 3 of the reports of this kind thrice a year for the UN Human Rights Council sessions and also for our internal. And main purpose is that we know, as Dr. Saab has rightly pointed out, many things about the report, about the American policy, the policymakers, what they say, what they do, and what are the some of the questions he raised about the report. They are there. They will remain always there. There's always a room for improvement in each and everything. But I think this has been a wonderful work which has been started. And like Dr. Saab said, that voices from Kashmir on Kashmir. That's a very important thing. So that that should be a document, as a historic document for our younger generation, for our others to follow, that what the people of Kashmir say, how they have continuously fought against the Indian oppression, right from, as Dr. Saab rightly said, from 1931, because there's a continuity of efforts from 1931 till date. It goes together, and people in Kashmir are united on one or the other things. So this report, as I see, in future, as directors have said that they have in pipeline the voices from Pakistan and others, but I will suggest also that while we document the voices from Pakistan, I was talking with the directors of that it should not only be political leaders. There are the academicians in Pakistan, the scholars in Pakistan who have wrote on the Kashmir issue, who have raised the voice at each and every level. Those should be also documented, so that as we always feel, our young scholars, whenever they come to us, they blame only one thing on Google. We get only Indian narrative, Indian, whatever Indians have said, that is in Google. We have very less publications from Pakistanis. So we have to do a lot on that perspective also, how our more and more publications are there. We report on this, and how we can do it on Google. That's the thing to be done by the people like you in front of me. So overall, when we go to the Kashmir, lastly, at present, when we see, Dr. Saab said, we should not say they are making demographic change, or we have to frame our argument differently, and we have to make them defensive. But I'll say, as far as current situation is concerned in Kashmir, electoral demographic changes have already been done. In Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, electoral demographic changes they have already done. As you have seen a few days back, the statement from the Indian election commissioners from Indian-occupied Kashmir that they are going to give voting rights to the armed forces, to the laborers, and to other civil servants, non-state subjects who are Indians who are working in Kashmir. They amount for 25 lakhs. So you can see this is 1/4 of already the whole population of Kashmir. And along with that, the new voters and the domiciles they have given, there's another topic. So you will have a whole chunk of people from India who will be voting in the coming assembly elections in Kashmir. So that is already the electronic demographic change. And also they have redrawn the boundaries of election through delimitation processes. So they are all set to have a Hindu chief minister in the next assembly, and BJP will be. If we will continue, I have been telling to our people that our all guns should be towards BJP and RSS. So we should not always keep on hammering on Farooq Abdullah, Mahbub Mufti, and other voices. We should not attack them at least at currently, because at this point of time, our point of view and theirs converge somewhere against the Article 3, abrogation of Article 370 and 35A. So, because if we continue like that, then we have put the whole ground very much open for the BJP, and BJP will take over the Kashmir as they want, and then they will do what they have already planned to do, what they have already announced about that. They will continue to do that. I think more work is to be done on that, and I think there should be some aggressive and regressive diplomatic initiatives also on that, which unfortunately we lack. Dr. Saab rightly mentioned that Prime Minister recently said war is no option, and the same was the case on the 5th of August in the Parliament of Pakistan. Then Prime Minister also said, should I go for war? War is no option. And that was where Indians got the lead. They did what they wanted to do, and there was no stoppage to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarks, Mr. Wani. Our second speaker is Mr. Ahmed Qureshi. Mr. Qureshi is a journalist focused on national security issues and human rights. As a journalist, he has 2 decades of experience working in conflict zones in the MENA region, and has extensively written on India and the Kashmir conflict. I now invite Mr. Qureshi for his remarks.
Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor to join you here. And Chief Guest Ambassador Asim Iftikhar Saab, it's an honor to see you here. As journalists, and especially journalists who are working on researching Pakistan's foreign policy, we get to know the tremendous role that our diplomats actually play in defending the interest of this nation, and you're the unsung heroes actually of our nation. So it's a great honor to see you here. And Secretary Asim Iftikhar Chaudhry Saab, I've always, and Khalid Mahmood Saab and Khalid Rahman Saab, we are students actually of your tremendous work. I'm still, by the way, almost finishing the book that you launched last year, a huge volume, took a lot of time, and in fact raised much more questions, answered many, but raised many questions. And I hope that we get an opportunity to have a session on that in future as well, to discuss actually the content, not just the launching and the ceremonial aspects of the book, but actually the content itself. So it's a great honor, and Khalid Rahman Saab, we've always been students of your tremendous work. And I congratulate Dr. Arshad Ali for this tremendous work. Actually, I want to congratulate you more because thanks to ISSI and India Study Center, you're breaking the monotony and the unifocal focus that we have in Pakistan on our domestic politics that we forget a tremendous, huge shift that occurred on Kashmir regionally, obviously, and internationally in the last 3 years, which is historic by all accounts, huge, big. Unfortunately, obviously, there were other things that happened in the world after COVID. It was natural that it would be sidelined somehow in the international media coverage, but it should not have been sidelined, at least in our media and in our national discourse. Yet it happened because of our excessive and exaggerated focus only on our domestic politics, forgetting the huge major shift that happened in Kashmir conflict in these 3 years since 2019. So with acknowledging this fact that you're actually ISSI and India Studies Center is actually, thank you for bringing this story back into the mainstream, and ISSI is the platform, the national platform, the Institute of Significance and Record to do this. So congratulations to this, and I'll just very quickly share a few points. This report, obviously, I was going through it, and it documents the amazing shift that happened, as I said, in this conflict. And we must acknowledge this thing. There's a shift in 7 decades, the way the world approached Kashmir and the way the world approached India. The language, the tenor, the way it is discussed, researched, and written about has changed. Many of the grievances that we had in Pakistan over the last half a century in terms of how the world approaches India and India's role in Kashmir and how the world approaches Kashmir and how the world explains Kashmir has changed. This is not a small development. It's a big, huge shift, and it should be recognized as such. So, and this report obviously is a step forward in acknowledging and recognizing that shift. We can see in the words of the world leaders who are covered in this document this shift. So that's one point. Just very quickly, I know this gets boring a little, but just very quickly, we need to also acknowledge, actually, what is this shift that happened? This shift began with the inclusion of Kashmir for the first time. The conflict began in, so to speak, as Khalid Rahman Sahib said, it's not actually, there's a continuity. It didn't begin in 1947. It goes much before that. But for the sake of political discourse, beginning from 1947, it was not until the year 2016 that Kashmir actually was listed and became part of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights annual international update on major conflicts in the world. And in 2016, in September, for the first time, with the developments in Syria, with the Rohingya, with other conflict zones in the world, for the first time, Kashmir was in the list, was added. It was a huge, huge surprise. And when it occurred, it happened in the hall of the UN Human Rights Council in September 2016. Altaf Hussain Wani Sahib, who heads a delegation of Kashmir, of Kashmiris from both the Azad state of Jammu and Kashmir, Azad Kashmir, and Indian-occupied Kashmir, for the first time, the international NGOs that represent human rights activists worldwide that normally used to pass by Kashmiri human rights activists in the corridors of the UN and sort of looked at them with a mixture of pity and a mixture of sort of support. For the first time, with this inclusion of Kashmir in the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights report in September 2016, actually, some of them actually got up from their chairs and went to the Kashmiri activists and congratulated them. And I still remember Mr. Wani telling me, and I witnessed that as well, some of them came up to the Kashmiris and said, congratulations, you have arrived. You've made it. So it was a huge thing. So beginning with the 2016, the addition of Kashmir in the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights report, and by the way, that report was not just cut and paste work. That report, for the first time, brought into international record cases of major, severe, and possibly could be war crimes that were well known to many of us in Pakistan, were very well known to within the circles of human rights activists in India, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, internationally, but were not widely known internationally. Many cases, there were many, many small cases. For example, the 1991 case of 2 Indian villages where women were sexually assaulted by Indian occupation soldiers overnight, right when the world was actually busy in the Iraq-Kuwait conflict in February 1991, and nobody paid attention to that story. From 1991, the victims were seeking redress. Nobody listened to them. And finally, in 2016, the UN and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights not only lists this case, among many other, but also with complete documentation taken from the Indian judicial system, the Indian court system, the Indian police system, and the occupation police system inside Indian-occupied Kashmir. So it was a huge thing. For the first time, this case and other cases also became part of international records. So the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was not just a public relations exercise. It was a bringing major cases of rights violations in Kashmir to a platform of international record, which is the Office of the Human Rights Commission. So that was another development. Of course, after that, we had tremendous other major developments, the 2 closed-door sessions of the UN Security Council. We had national parliaments of many countries of the world, including the US Congress, the British Parliament, the French, the European Parliament, holding special sessions on Kashmir. So we've seen these changes. We've also seen, and I as a journalist know this, because there was a time when we as journalists, if we'd go to, for example, Dubai or Cairo or Istanbul or London or Paris or Washington, D.C. or New York, and sit with other journalists or in media organizations, I do recall that it was a taboo to mention Kashmir and India and Kashmir, obviously, and especially if we were Pakistani journalists, because the world looked at it in a certain way and used to think of anyone mentioning Kashmir, and I'm talking about before 2016, and especially before 2019, anyone mentioning Kashmir would be seen in the bilateral prism of Pakistan, India, and the conflict between Pakistan and India and the issue between these 2 countries. But we saw a change after 2016, and especially after 2019 now. It's no longer a taboo. It's not a taboo now to mention Kashmir, to talk about Kashmir. This is a change that we as journalists, we see that internationally. And one more change that we have seen is, for the first time now, I find Kashmiri journalists at international media outlets being facilitated to tell their story. This has not happened in 7 decades. For the first time, Kashmiri journalists who were limited to working in Indian cities, or at the max, those who came to Pakistan to working in Pakistani media, now have international platforms really to tell their story and are being encouraged to tell their story, whether it's platforms in the US or the UK or Europe, and also in the Middle East. We see that in various Middle Eastern outlets, from Turkey to Al Jazeera in Qatar and many other outlets. And for the first time, we saw these outlets actually supporting Kashmiri journalists by sending them tickets and accommodation and spending on them to get them out of India, outside, so that they can freely tell their story. So we have these tremendous major developments that have happened. And I would like to conclude here with 3 points very quickly. The world is ready to engage, as Mr. Wani has just mentioned, and Khalid Rahman Sahab also mentioned this. The world is ready to engage, and we saw Indians come under pressure. It is not the impression that we often find, especially in our media in Pakistan, we saw at international conferences, we saw at events organized by international media organizations, we've seen how Indian diplomacy coming under tremendous pressure because of this unexpected new international interest in Kashmir. And we saw our friends in the Indian media, and we also saw, and I'm sure our diplomats in the Pakistan Foreign Service saw their colleagues, their counterparts in India, under tremendous pressure at various international forums. I recall, for example, there was an event for G7 countries in France, I think a couple of years back, before COVID, and I think India was invited, and Indian Prime Minister was there, and out of nowhere, it was G7, the world economy was being discussed, it was not really political, Kashmir obviously was not part of the agenda, but in bilateral meetings, Kashmir was raised. One leader probably raised it openly, a couple of them did it quietly, but it was discussed in media briefings in Paris. Indian diplomacy was under pressure. It came under pressure because of all of this. So, and the world is ready to engage. The world wants to engage us on Kashmir, wants to engage Kashmiris on this conflict, and this is a huge change as well that can be exploited. We've obviously seen also the media tide turning. What is lacking, however, or I would say not a downside, but we see, when I mention the world is ready to engage, we see that Pakistan narrative shaping is limited. Why? Because it's limited to our diplomats, Ambassador Iftikhar Sahab, our diplomats shaping the narrative. It's limited to that. Obviously, the diplomats are doing a tremendous job in sharing the narrative at official level. But our Pakistan's narrative shaping in this changing environment is limited to only our diplomats. I'm sorry to say this. The Pakistani media, the Pakistani key personalities, obviously politicians from every now and then issue statements. I would not say that's really much of a narrative shaping. But the narrative shaping which can happen with a combination of the media and key influencers in today's world, obviously politics are impacted by influencers from non-political and non-diplomatic backgrounds taking part in it. I'm sure all of you remember the issues of South Sudan and East Timor, how many influencers who are from non-diplomatic and non-official backgrounds taking part in it and helping these causes really come forward. That sort of narrative shaping is not happening in Pakistan. We are not doing it. I even tell you, we do not have, except maybe one or two, we don't really have even Pakistani journalists who can speak to the world and engage the world in the world's language on Kashmir, addressing a global audience, not a domestic audience. Not that we don't have the skilled people, obviously we have the people, but we don't have the focus on that. There are other more interesting pursuits that talented people that we have pursue than to actually focus on this area. So with all of this shift that we see in how the world approaches India, the Indian human rights situation inside India, occupied Kashmir, our exploitation, how we're using all of this is very limited to our diplomats doing the narrative shaping, while the rest of our national power, our media, and people who are followed by millions who could have contributed and spoken smartly, that is not happening, it's not there. And one challenge that we have, and I conclude with this, Khalid Rahman Saab mentioned, is that somehow the world is talking about Kashmir. It's true, there's a change, but it's all human rights. Nobody's talking about Kashmiri right to self-determination, and nobody's talking about conflict resolution, the political aspect of it. It's only, and that's a key point, Khalid Rahman Saab, that you raised. And your warning is very important. We should not get trapped into just talking about human rights, and this could be maybe an indirect victory to Indian diplomacy to turn Kashmir into just a human rights issue, and maybe if India improved the human rights situation, the Kashmir, that's it, the conflict is resolved. So that's a key point. But having said that, I will still say that human rights is, whereas you had a silence before 2016, human rights discussion, debate on Kashmir is a step forward, but shouldn't stop there. But we have a challenge, and Pakistani diplomacy has the challenge, but also we as Pakistani citizens and Kashmiris have a challenge now, how to convert this renewed international interest in Kashmir into a movement forward on the political track, on conflict resolution, because that is really not happening. And we need to push for that. And if after 6 or 7 decades, world leaders and many important people have come finally to speak up on Kashmir, that's a good thing, although it's only human rights. But I'm sure if we can come here, we can move forward the next couple of steps toward a political discussion on conflict resolution. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge for us. And a challenge that unfortunately, again, we are failing because we are not discussing it. And again, we're getting trapped into the human rights part, and we are busy in our national politics, which are important. Pakistan is a big country. We have huge politics, so much mess and chaos, obviously, in our politics. But we need to also focus on this, how to exploit this, the shift in the world's approach to India and Kashmir, to turn it, to convert it into a discussion on movement on the political track and conflict resolution. And with this, the global engagement, in leaving this podium, I just would like to say that we need to, I will emphasize, as a journalist, I have the freedom to move as a journalist, which sometimes, in limited situations, even beyond Ambassador Secretary Saab and Ambassador Iftikhar Saab, sometimes even beyond what our diplomats can do, because you have your official limitations. And I have felt the global engagement is a must. We must do global engagement. We must not shy. And our global engagement must not be limited to just expressing grievances and giving taunts and condemnations. So we should get out of just expressing grievances, taunts, and condemnations, move beyond that to positive engagement. Our diplomats already are doing that, no question, but as citizens, we have a much more field, a bigger, wider field to do that, and we do, because the world wants to engage us. Pakistan is a very, very important country. We journalists sometimes get into the trap of criticizing ourselves too much in our media, but when you go out and we meet people in our region and internationally, we see how the world really regards Pakistan's role, would like to see a great, great major role for both the Pakistani state and Pakistani citizens. So we need to do global engagement. We must not shy from that, and we need to get beyond these 3 words, expression of grievances, and taunts and condemnations, into positive engagement. Not everybody understands Kashmir. Some really do have agendas. That's fine. That's the world we live in. But we can move things forward. We need to do global engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Qureshi. Ladies and gentlemen, the chief guest for today's event is Mr. Asim Iftikhar Ahmed. Mr. Ahmed has previously served as Ambassador of Pakistan to the Kingdom of Thailand and as the permanent representative of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. He is currently serving as the spokesperson, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and as the Additional Secretary, United Nations. I now invite Mr. Asim Iftikhar Ahmed for his remarks.
Alaikum. Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a great pleasure to be once again be here at the ISSI. I would like to commend the continuing efforts and outreach activities of this institution, which actually complement the efforts that we at the Foreign Ministry and through our missions are doing to promote our interests on a number of issues. And as you know, Jammu and Kashmir is one of the core issues of interest, national interest for Pakistan. And I think this is a collective endeavor that we continue to take forward. Many thanks to Arshad Saab, Director, for this report. I'm grateful to colleagues, fellow panelists, Khalid Rahman Saab, Wani Saab, Qureshi Saab, for the remarks by Ambassador Azaz, and we have the Chairman, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, with us. And thank you so much. I don't have, I've left my notes over there, so I have only the notes which I took from the panelists, and this book or report, which is the subject. I think this needs to be flashed. This needs to be flashed because we say that Jammu and Kashmir is an issue on which, despite all our internal differences or divergences, there is complete national consensus. So, whatever government is in place, whatever the political leadership, we always say, and especially from the Foreign Ministry, that every government and all political leaders have always espoused and very passionately and fully and completely, I would say, advocated the cause of Kashmir, simply because of the reason that this is a national cause and there is complete national consensus. And when we say that we are the voice of the Kashmiri people, we represent them abroad. We help them go abroad and represent themselves, but we represent them. We are the voice of the Kashmiri people. So, this is adding to that voice. So, really appreciate this effort. I'm not going to go into detail, but, being the representative of the government and also having the experience of serving in the United Nations, where Jammu and Kashmir remains an issue on the agenda of the Security Council. And there are various forums in the UN, apart from Security Council, UN General Assembly, the Fourth Committee, which is the decolonization, the peacekeeping, the legal committee, and similarly on the human rights side, the Human Rights Council. There is quite a lot of scope and space for discussion on Kashmir, and we have been following this. So from the government's perspective, and I think this is for the benefit of the younger generation, as Asab said in the beginning, I think you are going to be the voices in the future, need to take this message forward as to what is our perspective, what is our position on Kashmir. So a couple of points. First, this issue has been there, we know, for over 7 decades and even going beyond that. But the situation has been really escalated. The environment has been vitiated since the illegal and unilateral actions that India took on 5th August, and there is a series of actions that they have undertaken since then, with 2 major objectives. I think it is very clear. They want to undermine the internationally recognized disputed status of Jammu and Kashmir. And secondly, it's very clear that they're trying to engineer a demographic change in the occupied territory with a view to converting the Muslim majority of IIOJK into a Hindu majority. So these are 2 key objectives that they are pursuing, and these are the actions that we are trying to counter through various moves, political, diplomatic, and other outreach. I would like to inform you that we are into this endeavor continuously since 5th of August. And on a continuing basis, a concerted effort has been deployed to create this awareness amongst the international community, to reach out to our friends and others in the international community, to reach out to the permanent members of the Security Council who have a special responsibility towards resolution of this dispute, to reach out to various senior position holders in the UN system, in the international community organizations, civil society organizations dealing with the various aspects of the situation, the political, human rights and humanitarian, the legal dimensions. We have undertaken a lot of work on lawfare as to what options are there. I think some of the discussion here also relates to that. I think going beyond the rituals, there are other things on which we have engaged. We have encouraged organizations to work on that. For example, you must have followed the Russell Tribunal kind of activity on Kashmir. We were closely engaged with that. We encouraged that. And there are other similar activities that are being undertaken. So I would say that basically there are three dimensions to the Jammu and Kashmir dispute: peace and security. This is the first. And I think that we need to, yes, you're right, we need to keep on emphasizing that this is first and foremost an issue of international peace and security. It has threatened in the past. There have been wars, physical wars fought on this, and it continues to be a threat. And that's why we say Kashmir is a nuclear flashpoint. So we keep on emphasizing this, and I think we have had success on this. As you mentioned, we have had, after over 5 decades, 3 sessions of the UN Security Council, which specifically discussed the Jammu and Kashmir dispute since 2019. And it remains there. It can be discussed again. We have been able, and this is also important to note and recall for the younger generation, that we have been able to retain this issue, and as Asab knows this very well, on the agenda of the UN Security Council for over all these years. And this is very, very important. And we have been able to retain it in a manner that, in the framework that is provided by the UN Security Council resolutions, which promise the right to self-determination to the Kashmiri people, in that basic framework which provide the guidance as to how this issue has to be peacefully resolved, there has been no change. So we stand there. We haven't lost anything. So, from the legal perspective, from the position of the UN pronouncing itself on this issue, we haven't lost anything. Yes, there are changes on ground. Yes, de facto there are changes which India is trying to introduce, but legally speaking, de jure, there is no change. And that's why I think it's very important because I think one of the statements, which is missing here, there is one statement from the UN Secretary General, but his more important statement was 3 days after 5th August 2019. And this was on 8th August. It's a short statement, and when people look at it, sometimes they seem to come up with the conclusion, well, it's not a very strong statement. Sometimes people say it's not a strong statement. It's just the usual. No condemnation, for example, of India, or things like that. But we know what is the value and strength of that statement. So if you have a look at the statement by the UN Secretary General of 8th August 2019, it starts with an expression of concern over what happened on 5th August. So very clearly. Then it expresses concern about the human rights situation. Then more importantly, it states that the position of the United Nations remain the same on the Jammu and Kashmir dispute. It is guided by the UN Charter and by the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. So this is directly opposite to what India has been saying and what it is trying to communicate to the international community, that this is no more relevant, the resolutions are outdated, etc., etc. And then lastly, and it was even more important, the Secretary General calls on both parties to refrain from taking any unilateral steps that could undermine the status of Jammu and Kashmir. So if you look at this statement, 4 or 5 simple points there, all in 100% conformity with the position of Pakistan on Jammu and Kashmir dispute. And I think this was a huge success for us, and it shows how Pakistan's position has been consistently driven home within the UN system, how the UN Secretary General was aware of the background. Obviously, he has to be aware of what's the background of this dispute and the way they communicated it. And that's why we know that India was entirely unhappy with this statement. They rejected it, whatever. They do this frequently. You know that UN Secretary General often comes up with the offer to provide his good offices or mediation on this issue of Jammu and Kashmir, which Pakistan always welcomes. We in fact welcome similar offers from our common friends, but India always rejects that. So I think it is very clear, and this is something that needs to be part of the narrative, that we have nothing to hide. Our position is very clear. It is totally in conformity with the UN's position on Jammu and Kashmir. And if anyone has to hide something, that's India. And that's why they don't want to engage. They don't want to acknowledge the role of the UN, of the Security Council, of the UN Secretary General, and our common friends who have advised them on a number of occasions that if both sides are willing, they are ready to play a role, but they don't accept because it's very clear that they want to hide their illegal actions in Jammu and Kashmir. Second point, obviously I have deliberated on this a little bit, the legal dimensions. I think we are standing on a strong footing. I often compare this with the situation in Palestine. People often say that as compared to Kashmir, there is a lot more activity on the Palestinian issue in the UN. There is a quarterly debate in the Security Council. Then there are debates in the General Assembly. Almost all committees of the main committees of the General Assembly. It's a permanent agenda item in the Human Rights Council. But when you compare as to what they have achieved and where do we stand with regard to Kashmir, I think especially from the legal perspective, I think and they have lost. You've seen how they have lost the territory over the years, and then you've seen that there have been subsequent resolutions in the Security Council especially, which have weakened the original position with regard to the Palestinian issue. We are not facing that problem. So still our position is the same, and no country has acknowledged that, and not even the UN, that the illegal and unilateral actions that India has taken, no country has acknowledged that. This is very important, because this is going to be, the same question as you say, when the plebiscite takes place. All of these changes, the new voters which are being fraudulently added, they cannot be part of that process who can take part in a plebiscite that has to be organized under the auspices of the United Nations, because it is very clear. 2 or 3 resolutions very clearly mentioned. One was 122 of 1957, that no process or electoral exercise, I'm not using the exact words, can be a substitute for this principle that was recommended by the Security Council, that the Kashmiris will determine their own future through a plebiscite, fair and impartial plebiscite, to be conducted under the auspices of the United Nations. So these electoral exercises, we know this, and they are not a substitute, and they will not be considered a substitute for any kind of so-called electoral exercise that India has been conducting or will conduct in the IIOJK. The third element is the human rights and the international humanitarian law dimension, as very rightly pointed out. I think on the IHL, this has assumed increased significance. We have focused a lot on that. You would have seen the dossier on human rights and IHL violations that we unveiled, presented last year in September at a very high-profile event. The foreign minister was there. And it documents in detail the kind of human rights violations, and particularly war crimes and similar possible crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated in IIOJK. They have been documented with audio and visual evidence, and this was very widely shared amongst the international community, from the Security Council members to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and members of the international community, the civil society, the international human rights and humanitarian organizations. I think we have been able to do this outreach quite effectively, and there are results from that. So I would say that we have undertaken efforts. We have engaged the international community at various fora apart from the UN. Our missions have been on the move since 5th August 2019, continuously engaging and briefing the host countries at various levels. And this is not only in the foreign ministries. This is with the members of the parliament. This is with the civil society. This is with the press and international media. This is with opinion makers, think tanks. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that you see there is increased activity, increased focus and attention on Kashmir over the past 3 years, for not good reasons, because we would not have liked to be in this situation, but still I think this increased focus and attention is there on part of the governments, their political leadership who have issued statements, the parliaments, the Congress, the US Congress, the British Parliament, EU, many other countries. They have discussed. They have had hearings and briefings on the Jammu and Kashmir situation. That is where I think, I agree to some extent that we should not overemphasize maybe the human rights dimension at the expense of the peace and security dimension and the need to resolve this issue. But on its own right, this issue is very important, because this has traction, especially among the Western countries and European countries. This has a lot of traction, and there's a lot of resonance, and it provides you the opening, because, and this is what we do. If you go to a common friend who's in a country who's has close relations with both India and Pakistan, If you go and start talking about Kashmir and immediately you go to a nuclear flashpoint and, you know, the Security Council resolutions, their, you know, instant response could be, well, we know this is a bilateral issue, you know, we recommend you, you know, discuss this bilaterally or whatever. But when you have the opening through the human rights dimension or the violation of international humanitarian law dimension, and they have to engage. Otherwise, you know, they would be blamed for double standards. You know, the human rights issue is an issue on which they focus a lot. And this is something on which there is a lot of receptivity when you talk to them. So I think it is from that perspective that we have been focusing on this, and there is a lot of movement on this. And this is also the result of the engagement that we have had over the years with the key stakeholders. You were mentioning the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So in the High Commissioner at that time, Sheikh Zaid Rad Al Hussain, we had someone who could rise above you know, the traditional ways in which the UN human rights machinery has dealt with this issue, and he was bold enough to call the shots, and that led to this development. We have had 2 reports by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of 2018 and 2019 with clear recommendation. They focus both on the Pakistan side and the Indian side, but the emphasis is on the Indian side because we know that the human rights problem is there. So it is very clearly recommended in these reports that the situation is frightening. It needs to be attended to, and the clear recommendation is to establish an independent commission of inquiry to examine in more detail. And that's why the Office of the High Commissioner has been asking for access to the Indian side of Kashmir, which they obviously don't allow. And they don't allow access to any other human rights, major human rights organizations. They don't allow access to the OIC even. And I would like to mention here specifically that apart from the UN's traditional position, I think one of the successes of Pakistan has been this consistent and very strong expression of support and solidarity that comes from the OIC. Again, here I would like to dispel some impressions which are there. Some people say OIC hasn't delivered anything on Kashmir. So they say that, you know, what use are these statements? I think this is an impression that needs to be strongly dispelled and countered. I think we should be clear. The resolution lies in the implementation of the Security Council resolutions. These were not OIC resolutions. OIC is lending its support, putting its weight behind the position of Pakistan on the Jammu and Kashmir dispute. So what they are also asking is that the UN Security Council resolution should be implemented to allow the Kashmiris to exercise their right to self-determination. So if that is not happening, it's not because of the fault of the OIC. OIC is putting its full weight behind, and we must recognize that there are 57 member states of the OIC. And when they support Pakistan's position, it means that you automatically have the full weight of 57 countries behind Pakistan's position on Jammu and Kashmir. And I think this is something that we need to recognize and appreciate. And that's why you would have noticed that whenever OIC issues a statement, it really hits hard the Indians. And then sometimes they have responded to that in totally, entirely undiplomatic way also, because this really pinches them, and they don't like it. And it's for obvious reasons that it's a very big group. It's the second largest multilateral organization after the United Nations. So when it supports Pakistan, I think we need to acknowledge and appreciate that. Just let you know that the OIC Secretary General, on the invitation of Pakistan, would be visiting Pakistan in the coming days, and there will be a lot of focus, obviously, on the Jammu and Kashmir issue as well. I think I've tried to cover almost all the points. Let me see if something is missing. Yeah, I think there was a comment about war is not an option. Well, I'm not going to, deliberate on the political aspects of statements, but you would have seen our own statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You would recognize, the familiar phrase, we stand in solidarity and provide moral, political, and diplomatic support. We've been saying that for quite some time. But all of our recent statements, if you see there is a difference, it says we are ready and are providing all possible support to the Kashmiri people till they achieve their inalienable right to self-determination. So this was one point that I think I thought I should highlight. One last thing, and I think this has been identified by Khalid Saab and Qureshi Saab also. When we say that this is an issue on which there is complete national consensus and the entire nation is behind that, what we would like to see is a not only whole of government but whole of nation approach on this issue, and on a continuing basis. And this is very important to not only shape the narrative inside the country but to project it outside. So, just to give you an example, and you've spoken already about that, just have a look at, not on a daily basis, but, when we are commemorating important days or milestones like 5th February, Kashmir Solidarity Day, or the Black Day, 27th October, or just recently, Yom Istisal. Have a look at the, in the 2-3 days preceding that day and the day after, what's the focus of our media, both print and electronic, on this issue. And I think you will conclude that there is a lot more that needs to be done there. So this has been our consistent message. And even when you look at the print media, for example, look at the op-eds or the especially written articles that were there on these occasions, you would see that these are mostly contributed by our former ambassadors, foreign secretaries like Azaz Saab and others. Why not the others? Why shouldn't they attach, enough importance to this and, come up with writings? We have so many of, renowned individuals who are read regionally and internationally. I think they should chip in and contribute. This is very important because, as you said, since 5th of August 2019, there is a sea change in the way the international community, the political leadership, and the mainstream international media is viewing India. And India has helped its, themselves on this. The RSS, BJP combine the Hindutva ideology, the way they have treated not only the Kashmiris but also the Muslims and other minorities in India, it has contributed to this. So we see that in the mainstream international media there is a lot of focus. A lot has been written and reported upon despite the censorship. and the blackout that India tries to maintain in IIOJK. So this is something that has happened in the last 3 years. We need to capitalize on it. We need to multiply this message. And for that, I think at the national level, our key people in both the print and the electronic media, they need to make their own contribution. I think this is very clear that this also indicates that there is a huge reputational cost that India has incurred because of its actions in Kashmir. And this is also something that we keep on pressing in all our interactions with our friends. In the end, just let me, I think there's no other conclusion but to state that the government and the people of Pakistan, they are really committed. They stand shoulder to shoulder with our Kashmiri brothers and sisters. In some of the seminars and similar discussions, we have seen sometimes some disappointment, some dissatisfaction, and I think that in many cases it may be rightly placed, because we need to understand that there on ground in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, our Kashmiri brothers and sisters, they are suffering on a daily basis. And the kind of sacrifices that they are offering, they are huge. And it's not easy to, put ourselves in that position. It's a very, very difficult situation. And that's why, their expectations are there. And they would like to see more being done. And this is a challenge for us. This is a challenge for the organizations like ISSI. I think the foreign minister was here and he spoke about, things, how we need to tackle this issue in different ways. What else can we do to convince the international community to pressurize India eventually? And this you would note in all our statements, and this is what Khalid said, the focus, we might be talking about human rights or IHL and other things, but the key message is that this is a dispute from the past, which is continuing, which is threatening international peace and security, and the international community must pay attention. And for that, the key message is that this must be resolved in accordance with the framework that was provided by the UN Security Council resolution. That is our key message, and we continue to push that. I thank you so much.
Now I request the Chairman, Board of Governors, ISSI, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, to present shields to the chief guest and our panel of speakers for today, followed by a group photo with the ISC team. Mr. Khalid Rahman. Mr. Altaf Wani. And finally, Mr. Ahmed Qureshi. I now request the chief guest and the panel of speakers for a group photo with the ISC team. This brings us towards the conclusion of today's event. We are thankful for all the speakers for their precious time and remarks. All the guests are requested to join us for refreshments. Thank you.